Good evening, everyone, again. Okay. All right. I'm Julie Koo. I'm the director of the Mayor's Office on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs. I think I know most of you who are here today, and thank you so much for coming out today for this panel discussion. And how many of you guys know that this year is the 10th year anniversary of Language Access Act? Yeah, most of course, from OHR, right? Yes. You should know, and all the panelists here. So 10 years ago, around this time, which was 2004, the Language Access Act was established in DC, and I was one of the fortunate people to witness the birth of Language Access Act. And 10 years has passed, and this year we are celebrating the 10th year anniversary of Language Access Act. So in the office we were discussing early, I think it was like last October, I'm talking about the plan for language access and this year, and Neel came up with this great idea to do something called 10 for 10, which is to celebrate and commemorate 10th year anniversary of Language Access Act. Why don't we do 10 different projects or activities to celebrate? So, okay, that's a good name, 10 for 10, right? So we are doing this 10 for 10 to celebrate and commemorate the 10th year anniversary of Language Access Act this year. So some of you were at the launching event earlier this year. It was, I think, back in January. And we also conducted language access survey as well as conducted photo project, which will be also featured today at the reception area. And also some of the pictures are here as well. And also we'll be publishing and announcing the report on Language Access Act and the effect. We're going to discuss the effect of Language Access Act in the AAPI community DC. So I think Neel is going to talk about it a little bit more in detail later. But I want to make sure that I mention a couple of things from the report, which was really promising and positive. And so the couple of things. The one was that the percentage of Asian language documents out of all total translated documents doubled since FY 2000 till FY 2014. And the second point was that the percentage of Asian language speaking employees out of all total bilingual employees doubled since FY 2000 till FY 2014. And the last one was that from FY 2011 to now, the district has seen the most steady increase in the percentage of Asian language translated documents. So those 3 points were something we thought that it was really promising and good, positive trends that we saw from this report. And unfortunately, we cannot release it yet. It's not finalized, but next month you will be able to see the report. I want to thank the panel who are here today and truly representing the past and present and also future of language access here. So Francey Youngberg, who was here before the Language Access Act and worked on many of language access related issues, and also being a pioneer to and also spearheaded the Language Access Act to be established in the city. Aryan Rodriguez Bocquet, who is the first director of Language Access Program in Office of Human Rights, and the person who's in charge of leading the Language Access Coalition right now, who's Sapna Pandya. And we also have Mónica Palacio, who was recently appointed as the director of Office of Human Rights, but also she was serving as a director of Language Access Program under OHR before. So these four people can definitely talk about in details and in depth about language access. But I want to also make sure to recognize and introduce someone who's standing next to me. And I can actually say that this entire project was really single-handedly put together by Neel Saxena. So why don't you guys give him a big applause and big round of applause. Neel Saxena is the language access coordinator for our agency and deputy director of OAPIA, which is the agency who put together this event. And he's going to be the one moderating today's panel discussion. So without further ado, please welcome Neel Saxena.
Thank you, Julie. I'm really excited to be here. I've been with the Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs for 10 years now. So when the act was passed, I was hired just to work on language access. And the progress that I've seen throughout the years has been wonderful. And I think our report found a lot of those details, as Julie mentioned before. One of the points that I wanted to bring up is the reason why we go back to 2000, the act was passed in 2004, is the district actually officially implemented a mayoral order in 2000 around language access for the Asian Pacific Islander community and the Latino community under the mayor at the time. And so that's why we look at that comparison from 2000 all the way up to 2014 in the district. Julie mentioned the report. I just wanted to get into a couple of details about the report. We'll provide some more information when that comes out. The report is actually broken into 4 parts. We look at the demographics over the last 10 years. And actually, we look at the demographics going all the way back to the 1980s. That's when our office was created. And it should give you everyone a sense of where the district was then and where we are now. The other part of the project that we did is we tried to look at how do we measure success in language access. Is there a measure that we can look at? It was difficult to do. We tried to use 2 proxy measures to see where language access is, looking at, particularly in the Asian American community, the number of bilingual employees who have been hired and the number of translated documents. And like Julie mentioned, that both of those have doubled over the last 14 years, and I think that's a very good information for the district and language access. The last 2 parts of the report is we did a survey in the community to find out how does the community feel about language access. A lot of times in my job and when we talk in the office, and you'll see here, we talk about the numbers and we talk about panels like this and we have different reports. But what we wanted to do is really hear from the people and from the community and what is their perceptions and what do they feel. And so that's contained in the report. And I think the other part of that survey was what motivates individuals from the community to access language access. Why would they come use district government services? One of the most interesting things we found out, which is something we hope will inform moving forward how we publicize language access, is that the services are free. I think the community still doesn't fully understand and grasp onto that concept that the services under language access are free. So I think that's something that we were able to discover for each of the different major communities within the Asian community, within the Chinese speaking, within the Vietnamese speaking, and within the Korean speaking community. The other part of that in terms of language access, what motivation was, the services be fast. So I think a lot of people talked about when they come get the service that it'd be readily available and they can easily use it. So I think those 2 motivating factors for them, they mentioned they would encourage them to access the services more. So I think that report will provide a lot of information, and I hope you all stay for our reception where we go into our project called I Got a Story to Tell. And Julie will talk more about that at the reception. But like Julie mentioned, there are a couple photos here. And we did 31 photos of different community members and individuals. And I encourage you all to take a look at the photos. And some of those individuals are also here. And we have interpreters, so if you are interested in asking them more questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them questions. So without further ado, I would like to get to our esteemed panel. I'm very excited to have worked with everyone here. And what we'll do first is if we could have everyone, maybe starting with Aryan, go down and just give a quick brief introduction. And then I've given everyone questions in advance. And so we can then go back around and then I will read the question and then we can answer the different questions. So Aryan, do you want to start?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. And as Francey and I were talking, we couldn't believe that it's the 10th anniversary of the Language Access Act. It's been a long journey and a very rewarding and challenging one, too. Briefly, as Neel and Soohyun mentioned, I was the Director of Language Access from 2004 to about 2010. So when the law initially passed. I will say that what language access means to me, as someone that came from a family that predominantly spoke Spanish, it means more than just providing access to services, but making sure that those services are actually meaningful to that individual and providing them with that support to be able to live a life that's actually of quality. Currently, I have grandparents that are limited English proficient. They need a lot of assistance in their language, and it makes me a little nervous for them as they grow older in terms of healthcare, in terms of access to services. So it's really important to me, and it has been throughout my entire life, to really, I guess, take this mission and work toward the betterment and the achievement of it. I'm currently working with My School DC, which is the common lottery for DC public schools and charters, and their parent engagement efforts there, and still working very closely with the mayor's office to make sure that communities here, specifically the Asian American communities, fully understand their rights in every aspect of government services. So very excited to be here and to speak with all of you.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I'm Francey Lim Youngberg, and I think they invited me to this because they know that this was about 24 years ago when I first came to the district and really saw some of the very reasons why this DC Language Access Act is so important to our community. I was a young lawyer then and saw that we have so many people in our communities who can't ride a bus, who can't talk to the parents, you know, with the parent-teacher conferences at schools, who couldn't apply for public benefits. They couldn't figure out, you know, how do they report a crime because they spoke a different language other than English. And this is especially important to me coming from an immigrant community. I came here when I was 11, so I was the interpreter for my grandmother, and I think many of you probably can relate to that. It is a really experience that it's hard for you to forget, and you know how important it is, as Aryan said, not just because it's important to access, but it's important about being a citizen in the United States, being part of the society that we all live in. And so at the time, I was the president of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association, and we worked on a pro bono basis with several of the community groups. At that time, there weren't many, but we certainly worked with many of the merchants on the ground. At the time, we had about 2/3 of the small business licenses were owned by Asian Americans. And unfortunately, at the time, the police force had about close to, I think, 3,500 some police officers, and they only had 8 people who could speak an Asian language. So it was clear that you couldn't even be able to report a crime or understand about the criminal justice system if you didn't speak the language. And so that's how it started in terms of us providing pro bono services and working with the various communities. I really have to commend the Asian Pacific American Legal Center because they're the ones who helps start the coalition of African American, Latinos, Asian Americans to form the DC Language Access Coalition. And I think it's so fitting that we're in this very building today because the hearings in June of 2002 and then in November of 2002 were in this very same building. And it was a couple years later, obviously in 2004, when the legislation had passed. So it's a little bit of a picture of what it was like. This was 20 years ago. And when I heard Soohyun talk about the doubling of the numbers of translated documents of bilingual employees, it really shows the progress that's been made. And that's thanks to the hard work of the folks here, and especially the communities who've continued to ask for these changes. So I also want to just say that I'm here in my personal capacity. I'm currently the Deputy Assistant Secretary at HUD. And one of the things that really impressed me from my experience here is that even now, when I represent HUD at the White House Initiative on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs, I remember those days, and I know how important it is to all the communities. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mónica Palacio. Buenas tardes. I'm also very pleased to be here with you today. Like my peers, I too come from an immigrant family from South America, Colombia, and I saw my parents and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles struggle to become part of society and culture here because of the language. So that was my early inspiration to do this work. I've been in the district now 25 years. And my work has also taken me through the legal profession and also doing access to justice work and working with immigrant communities around the country. So I've actually worked in places like Arkansas and Texas and Seattle and Chicago, looking at how cities and particularly law enforcement struggle with the tensions that can arise because of cultural misunderstandings and also communication breakdowns, because language is so critical. So I'm really thrilled to be with you here today. I have a lot to say about what the Office of Human Rights is doing, but I will say that I'm very proud of the work, looking back at all the leaders and advocates who have done this work not just for 10 years, but for 30 or 40 years. Many of our communities and linguistically isolated communities have been fighting this fight for many decades. So we stand on their shoulders, and I'm so thrilled that the Office of Human Rights can play an important role, and I'll say more about that role later.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. And I'm also very excited to be on this panel and to have worked with, met everyone. It's really exciting to be on a panel of friends and to be in a room of friends as well. I'm the executive director actually of a group called Many Languages, One Voice. And so I actually alone am not the head of the DC Language Access Coalition. We administer the Language Access Coalition, which, as was mentioned earlier, came into formation in 2002, really, to fight for the language access law that we have today to get passed. And the coalition today is about 40 different organizations. Many Languages, One Voice is one of them, and we administer and host the coalition. But we work in partnership with so many other organizations, which is one of the things that makes my work so rewarding, is the seeing across different immigrant communities. Unfortunately, some of the challenges that we are still facing, as well as some of the victories that we've had as well. So I guess I wanted to just, in closing, and I'll, like Mónica, talk more about what Many Languages, One Voice actually does. Just mention that I too come from an immigrant background. My parents actually moved from India in about 40 years ago, and I was born in DC. I'm a DC native, and my family still lives in the DC area, so I'm very much from DC and consider this to be my home, which is very exciting to be doing this work here. But because I come from that background, I know myself very personally, as was mentioned before, what language access means, which is why typically, even to my parents and to my family, I don't always say I do language access work, because that's a very technical term that a lot of people may not know, but I actually say that I do immigrant rights work, because at the end of the day, that's really what it's about. It's about empowering our immigrant communities and making sure that we as immigrants here are able to access everything that anybody else is able to. And so that, at the end of the day, to me, is how I would define language access. And I will continue to talk more about what the future of language access can look like.
Thank you very much. So now we will go into the question and answer session. So I'd like to first actually start off with Francey, community first. So what were the top 3 API language access issues in the beginning?
I think I started with it a little bit earlier, but I can elaborate a little further. That I think the primary problems that we were facing back in 1993, 94, when I started getting involved, is that at the time, I think we had Mayor Sharon Pratt Kelly, we had Chief of Police Fred Thomas. It was at a time when the Asian Pacific American community here was just, they just didn't know the diversity of the various languages. So first you had the trouble of trying to figure out what are the languages that we would need. And since there were so many different languages, and at that time, given the population that we were working with, the merchants who spoke mostly Korean and Chinese, we also had a lot of the nail salons were owned by the Vietnamese, the people who lived on Park Road spoke Vietnamese, and so those were the three languages that we prioritized. Given that this was a lot more complicated than that, we had to first put out the three languages that we think we could start with. And also, one of the big problems was that there wasn't the infrastructure of groups, advocacy groups, or people in the leadership in the community to help push for this. So a lot of the work was really done on an ad hoc pro bono basis by different people, including our group, the Asian Pacific American Bar Association. And the first attempt at this, as was already mentioned before, was in 2000 when Mayor Anthony Williams, working with Soohyun, whose predecessor, Greg Chen, had put together a plan for language access. And so the first priority was really getting the police department, at that time already had a 911 system where if you called and you spoke a different language, they can transfer you to an operator. And it had the capability of about 120 some languages. So that is one of the early victories in terms of just getting people to be able to report a crime. So I think the number of languages that we needed to focus on, the lack of the advocacy and the infrastructure so early on were all things that we struggled with. And the third, frankly, is having reliable data. And this is where it's really important for all of you who are collecting data and analyzing it, because it was hard for advocates to make the case of what did we need for what in terms of languages, how many people, are being served, and will people be using it? So that was another critical point that we had to advocate for at that time. So I feel that during that time period, there were enough people that were working on this to at least get the seeds going. But it really took the DC Language Access Coalition and a more formal, more sustained effort over time to really get to the next level of developing language access for people in the community.
Thank you, Francey. Ryan, you get the next question. What was the focus of the program in the beginning? And can you talk about any challenges particular to the API community?
Yes. So as Francey mentioned, I'm so glad to be an infrastructure within the government to be able to support the different communities that reside here in the city was the primary focus. So despite the fact that there had been really great efforts from the very beginning to build upon advocacy efforts to pass a law, but even before that, establish mayoral liaison offices to be that liaison from the DC government to the communities, but also to create community-based organizations and bridges between those community-based organizations and the government. Despite all those efforts, we still didn't have the response that was needed by communities to really provide them with the access to services that they needed. So communities, in turn, then built support systems for themselves to be able to access government services, which should be the other way around. So what was beautiful about this language access law is that it mandated access to government services in communities' languages. So it actually built that support network, or theoretically built that support network for communities so that they themselves didn't have to bring that support network with them anytime they had to access a service. So what we focused on in the very beginning was to ensure that we had representatives at the major agencies that were coordinators for this program. We needed leaders within the agencies to really establish a program within the agencies. We also needed to get buy-in from agency heads. So we required that agency directors sign off on every piece of language access material for each agency step that they took to improving their language access services. So if there was a report, agency heads needed to sign off on it. If it was a plan, agency heads needed to sign off of it. That was really important to us because it showed accountability from the top. Another thing that we focused on was sort of making sure that this culture shift, that DC government agencies and agency staff really understood what providing language access services meant. It wasn't just about translating a document, which was absolutely crucial because a lot of that didn't exist. It wasn't just about providing an interpretation service, which was also crucial because that, despite the fact that that was a win with MPD, agencies had it for so many years and were never using it. So it was really leveraging existing resources, identifying those different resources within agencies that they already had, and showing them the power that by using something like a language line or something like a bilingual staff member could really do to make their services more impactful to the communities that they were serving. The data collection piece is huge and I think is still lacking. It was lacking when I was there. There's really no easy and direct way to collect language data. There's many different ways of asking that question, but really getting to what you're looking for is kind of challenging. So we are guessing half the time as to who needed language access services and who didn't. So that's also a critical piece. I think finally, it was creating a budget within agencies to really support these services. Language access, it's claimed that language access is an unfunded resource. It's an unfunded mandate. There's no sort of appropriations attached to the law that really significantly support the 60+ agencies within the DC government. But based on federal law and based on the programs that agencies currently provide to support the needs of all their constituents, language access should and needs to be built within those budgets. And we worked a lot with the mayor's offices and with the mayor's budget office to make sure that that started making a footprint within agencies' budgets. In terms of the challenges that I felt the API communities faced was that they were sort of, there's several, they were sort of in the shadow of the language majority, the language minority majority, which was the Spanish-speaking community. That was the largest and continues to be the largest language minority group in the district. So that was the first challenge, getting agencies to see that there was another language other than Spanish or languages other than Spanish that they needed to address. Another challenge is that there's a mayor's office on Asian and Pacific Islander affairs, and there's a mayor's office on African affairs, and then there's a mayor's office on Latino affairs. So Latino affairs deals with one language. Asian and Pacific Islander affairs, as Francey mentioned, deals with hundreds of languages. So it was very, I think, clever of advocates in the beginning to focus on those primary languages, but even so, it's not just the Asian language that someone speaks, right? There are 3 different languages, 3 different cultures, 3 different needs for those communities. Same with African affairs. There's no one African language. So I think just getting agencies to really make that shift, that the way that you outreach to the Spanish-speaking community is different than the way you could outreach and potentially really grasp the attention of the Vietnamese community or the Chinese community or the Korean community. So just those nuances, I think, has been and continues to be a culture shift that really needs to be focused on. So those were the early challenges that we faced. I'm sure that it's continued to be faced in some way, but it's some that I think were evident and predominant, and I think we worked really well as a team, Neel, to address. So,
thank you, Aryan. Mónica, the next question is for you, since Aryan has talked about the past. If you could talk about what's the focus of the program now, and moving forward. If you want to go 10 years, that's great.
I'll try not to.
But the focus of the program in the future, and what do you feel are kind of some of the impacts of in the API community of some of the things that you guys are looking to do.
Okay,
Great.
so thank you, Neel. So where are we now? Well, I have to say a little bit about the last 2 years because Aryan brought up some good points. It was very important in the beginning for the agencies that are named as having major public contact to have certain systems in place. So one of the changes we've made over the last 2 years was to not only have a person and a director who are accountable, but to create an agency team. And I see two of my colleagues here from DPW, Director Howland, Director Majette from DCRA, and they're two great examples of agencies that dedicated not just somebody to sign off and come to meetings, but a team of people to pay attention to policy, outreach, customer service. Who comes in? Where do they sit if they need an interpreter? Where do they sit if they have to use a phone on speakerphone? How do we get the translated forms into the hands of the right agency staff? So all of that has been sort of like really, really building every step, every system to make sure any customer that comes in gets the service they need. So that's one thing. Another thing that I'm really proud of that OHR and the Language Access team we have has done is work on our websites. Now, there's a lot of controversy also in the beginning about using programs like Google Translate, where you put in a phrase and push a button and it translates it. That's not a culturally competent, reliable way to go from one language to another. So in the last year, we pushed our agencies very hard to translate all their core information about the work their agency does for us, the customer, into the top 6 languages. So that means that you don't have to, if you're a Vietnamese speaker or a Chinese speaker, you don't have to go to an English website and try to figure out how many clicks to get information. You can go to the front of the website and just scroll to the bottom, and in Chinese you can read services and go right there and get all the information you might need in your language. So that's been a huge push right now. That is actually just under completion as we speak. So 33 agencies will have this available. In a matter of weeks it'll be completed. So we're very excited about that. We need to let the communities know. So we need your help. One of the big challenges, I think, has already been alluded to. The Asian community is not a monolithic, homogeneous, linguistically, singular community. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of languages. Not to mention cultural nuances, right? How to speak to somebody, how to address somebody, how to welcome them with a question, how to get information that might be personal. All of these are cultural competency skills that even if you speak a language, it's not enough. It's not enough to ask a question in a certain way just to get a piece of paper signed that misses the whole picture of what the services that person might need. So I think that to that end, and I'll use the Department of Public Works as a great example, we trained over 700 frontline employees last year. We trained them for several hours in how to ask a question respectfully, how to think about talking through an interpreter, how to practice that, to come up and come in front of the room and role play. So these types of skills, we take them for granted, but they're absolutely necessary if we really want to provide true access. So I'm really thrilled that we've been able to do more and more of that, because it's not enough to say, you must do this. You have to build the capacity, and you have to inspire the motivation. Many of us are motivated because we saw our family members struggle, or a neighbor, or a friend. Sometimes people haven't had that experience. We need to give them the tools and also the motivation to say, you know what, I'm going to ask an extra question. I'm going to, put on my friendliest face, because maybe this person has come to the U.S. and they're a survivor of terrible violence in their country. Maybe they're a survivor of having gone through government repression. We don't know. So how do we create government systems that are not only accessible but welcoming and effective. And I think that's the future of language access. We have to think about all the languages and the cultural nuances that go along. I think the last piece I'll say is that I do want to thank the agencies, because I know that I, for many years, was an advocate, a little bit on the outside, as they say, so I came in and saying, we have to. We can't say maybe. We can't say, you know, we'll get there. Let's do it now, now, now. And I tell you, I've been very, very pleased and thrilled to find agency leaders and agency senior staff who say, you know what, Mónica, you're right. The time is now. We've done some good work, but we really need to go all the way. We need to close any gaps in access for all of our district residents. And I want to thank the agencies for doing that.
Thank you, Mónica. So we would like to close the panel out with Sapna. So if you could talk about where do you think the language access program should go, and how do you think it will affect the API community?
Sure, thank you. And so I want to start, I don't want to be the sort of negative voice here, I suppose, but in response to the overall title of the event, which is Ground Broken, we actually, and the ground has been broken through the Language Access Act being passed, no doubt about that. But 2 years ago, we actually commissioned a report called Access Denied. So that's sort of our response on the advocate side, and sorry, I can hold that up. That's actually our response to the idea of ground broken, is that unfortunately still, there are a lot of cases of access being denied, and this report was written after collecting surveys and stories from hundreds of community members, including Asian community members, Latino and African immigrant community members. And so I'm not going to read the whole report, although I always come with lots of materials, and I'm happy to share any of this. We have the summaries translated in many different languages. But some of the key things that we're still seeing today, and that I really think are important to focus on for the future, is our young people, are the youth. And I think that's sort of where I want to go with this. One of the key things that we've seen in the data that we are learning about the immigrant communities in DC is the high numbers of what's called linguistic isolation, which are households in which nobody over the age of 14 speaks English. And this is a real issue. There are high numbers in our Asian and Pacific Islander communities. 70% of Chinese households, 50 and 60% respectively of Vietnamese and Korean households are what's called linguistically isolated. That means that the only people that speak English in the house are kids, are young people, people under the age of 14. So what does that mean in a typical household? Let's say in an Asian household, right? That means that it's a young person, a 14-year-old, for example, that is translating documents for their parents, that are interpreting. And I know this because this is something I did myself when I was younger than 14. Translating documents that come home from school, translating the prescription information, any medical information, being the interpreter themselves, right? We work with high school students, and they're really great about coming for all the meetings. We meet about 3 times a week. The only times that I see Asian and Pacific Islander young people not come to the meetings is because they have to go with their parents or their grandparents to a doctor's appointment, to the pharmacy, or to go to school, let's say to back to school night, and be the interpreter themselves, right? They are interpreting for their parents and their teachers about their own school performance. Imagine what that's like as a young person say, oh yeah, mom, don't worry, I'm all straight A's, don't worry. They're the ones interpreting, right? And not just for themselves, for their younger siblings as well. So at age 14, they're suddenly adults. They're the ones doing all of this. They're not getting the news, unfortunately, still, especially in Asian languages, about scholarships, about AP classes, about the lottery, about so many things that they need in order to be able to access the school system well and fairly. It also means that they they're not getting the same experience that their African, Latino, and African American and white and other communities are getting in school. So what does that mean? That means at the end of the day, unfortunately, our young people are dropping out. We've seen the statistic recently that 50% of what's called English language learner students, many of whom are Asian and Pacific Islander, are dropping out. They're not finishing high school in 4 years, as they should be, which means they're delaying going to college. That means that they are maybe delaying getting a job. And they need those jobs, as we know, because there's a real lack of affordable housing for immigrants who don't speak English as a first language. Right here in DC, we're seeing in Chinatown, for example, where I know many of our Asian seniors still live, that there are plans upon plans to bring in expensive condos without preserving the affordable housing that needs to exist. And many of our young people live in those buildings. What does that mean at the end of the day? They're the ones that have to go out and get jobs in order to help their parents pay the rent, right? Which actually makes it even harder for them to finish high school, finish their homework. They come to the office to do their homework because they have nowhere else to go, right? So these are the things that we're still seeing among our young people, among our future, among Asian American youth in DC. And so what do we do to fix that? Of course, we need to be actually enforcing the Language Access Act in DC public schools, in Department of Human Services, where people rely on food stamps, on TANF, on housing vouchers, on all the things that you need as a low-income family, let's say, to be able to survive in the district. It also means that we do need more training. I totally agree with Mónica here, and I'm very happy to see the trend that we're seeing with more bilingual hires in our agencies. But at the same time, we have a severe lack of trained interpreters to speak Asian languages. And that's part of the reason why Neel was mentioning earlier, time is so important. It's true. You don't want to sit there waiting for 6 or 7 hours in the hospital emergency room for an interpreter to show up. But if the hospital doesn't have enough trained Vietnamese or Chinese or Korean or Hindi or any other language interpreters to call, then you are going to be sitting there much longer. So while we're training people in the agencies, we also need to be, as a community, as a city, be training ourselves, whoever is bilingual in the room, let's say, to be a trained interpreter, and sharing that training with more of our community members as well. So that's one thing. And I'll just end with some of the maybe more technical stuff around the law itself. So the law, as it was passed, was great for when it was passed. And since then, in the last 10 years, we have seen a lot of things that could be done to make the law even better as well. One thing, and we have spoken to some council members about maybe amending the law, and we need all the community's help in order to do that. A couple things that we might want to add to make it even better for the next 10 years. One thing is the right to appeal a decision. So I don't know how many of you know, but right now, if you don't get language access at an age, complain. You can go on the OHR website. You can also get the language access complaint forms in person. You can come to Many Languages, One Voice. And knowing your rights is super important, and that's one of the rights that you have. On the back of my business card here, you'll see in Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean, it says, I need help and I have a right to receive it in my language. And so please, I have many of these you can take and share and pass around. And one of those things, like I said, is the right to complain. And I know this because my family and my community doesn't do this either, we don't complain as much as maybe we should be, right? To actually say, I went to get my Medicaid application and it wasn't in my language. Right? Not just finding the one English-speaking relative that we have in our family to translate that, but instead going to OHR and saying, I need this in my language, is what we really need to be doing more of. So having that right to complain is super important, but at the same time, if we complain and then nothing happens, then I know it can be very discouraging. And that has happened a few different times. I can point to the instance of a Korean dry cleaner several years ago who wanted to take the exam to be able to run the dry cleaning machines in Korean, in his language. And he said that he really needed that test, the exam in Korean, so that he could really understand how to use the dry cleaning machine. So he didn't get that test in Korean. He complained and he said that he really should be getting it. And after filing the complaint, unfortunately, it was found that the agency didn't have to translate it in Korean. It wasn't necessary for the agency to translate it in Korean. And so he just went about finding somebody else to translate it for him. But the problem is that what we really need to have is the right to be able to appeal that. In other words, to go back and to say, actually, we disagree. We think the agency has to put that in Korean because there are X number of Korean speakers, or because this one individual wants that assistance, right? So that right to appeal is something that we hope that the law can open up to allow us to have, as well as what's called a private right of action. And I'm not a lawyer, but I know that what that really means is essentially the right to sue, the right to say that I didn't get that, and that means that my rights have been violated. We know legally and otherwise that language is a part of our national origin. It is very much a part of who we are, our culture, and very much linked to our culture, our race, and our ethnicity. So it is actually a fundamental discrimination if we are not getting services in our languages. And so in other laws, we are able to actually go and say, we want a monetary reward, basically. We're going to sue in order to get that service in our language. And in Oakland, California, which is another place that has a language access law, they have the right to sue. We don't have that here in DC. And so that is something that we are also, we've been speaking to some council members about, because they're the ones that passed the laws and the amendments, to see if we might be able to open up the law in the next 10 years to have that right, what's called a private right of action. So those are just some things, that I wanted to mention. Enforcing the current law, but then moving beyond the current law and trying to make it even stronger, protect our communities even more, and to have our communities exercise their rights is, at the end of the day, one of the most important things. And so again, I encourage you to take my business card, pass this around to as many people as you'd like, and also pick up copies of any of our reports as well that share more of the stories of how people in Asian and Pacific Islander communities really need these services. We need these services in our languages, but we need to speak up and have our voices heard about that.
Thank you, Sapna. Thank you to all the panelists. Before we start the question and answer session and then close out the event, I'd like to invite the Deputy Mayor, Bibi Otero, up here to say a few words.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you to the panelists. I'm sorry I missed part of the panel, but and certainly it is not the first time that I get a chance to hear this discussion and conversation. As Monica was saying, I spent, similar to Monica, lots of years on, as I say, on the outside, and as an advocate, and in fact was part of the community movement that led to the Language Access Act in 10 years ago. And, it was groundbreaking 10 years ago. It should be the norm now, and it still isn't across the country. DC is still very much a leading force in terms of this. And when I came in as Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services in the district, much like Monica said, I got to see a different side of this, right? I got to see what the implementation looks like and how difficult that is from an agency perspective. That doesn't mean that we not do it, but it does mean that we need to make sure that within government we are supportive of the agencies, we're supportive of their budgets, we're supportive of what's needed in order for them to comply with the law. And I think we've worked very hard in this administration to do that. It's important to also, life changes, and in 10 years lots of things have changed. So some things that may have not been in the law or covered by the law maybe are things that we have to, that we may have to think about now. So I think that's a really critical piece of constantly reviewing, revising, and improving, even something that was as good as it was when we first did it 10 years ago. So, but I do want to applaud all the city agencies who really make a significant effort, develop their plans, and are able to put their materials in multiple languages, as well as provide access to services. It is important for us to understand that there's cost related to that, and I think we have to make sure that we're paying attention attention to that for all of the agencies. The other thing that I think is really critical, and for those of us who work in the government, is to remember that there is turnover, and there are people who may be in our agencies now that were not around when we put this in place. And so the ongoing training and information around what language access means is an ongoing education process. And so there is an education process on the community side about what our rights are, and there's also a process within government and within the agencies about what our responsibilities are. And those two things have to go hand in hand. So I'm thrilled that we have events like this that remind us that that we're doing good work and that we have good work to continue to do. And just thank those who are on the ground making sure that they're keeping us honest around this. So thank you very much, and just congratulations for continuing. I'm just always amazed that something that we did 10 years ago is still really living and breathing. And and I want to recognize Ariana Quiñones, who's here, who's my chief of staff, who was also, when she was in her other life, incredibly active in making sure that this was part of the work that we did as in the community, and that we held the city accountable. So thank you for letting me speak.
So now I would like to actually open it up to a couple questions, if anyone has any. Anyone? Okay.
I have two questions. What is the annual value of translated documents produced by this program? And the second question is,
Do you think you could repeat the first question?
Okay, just what is the annual...
The annual volume of documents produced.
Yeah, what is the annual value of
Yeah.
translated documents by this act on a yearly basis? I mean, across all these 6 languages.
Thank you. So every agency translates their own documents. So there are reports filed with the Office of Human Rights, both quarterly and every 2 years, that tell us the number of calls to use an interpreter, for example, and the number of translations that have been done in which languages. So it will vary greatly between one agency to the next. You couldn't really compare DHS to, a different agency, a smaller agency or bigger agency. So if you wanted an exact number, we could calculate that for you, depending on if you wanted a quarterly number, an annual number, but there's really no way to tell. In 1 year, an agency could translate 50 documents, and then they won't need to update those for 2 years or 5 years. So it varies greatly. Yeah.
My second question is, have any of these agencies with major contact ever used Google Translate or any other computer-assisted programs?
Right. There's a legend about that happening, but I can tell you that I've been involved with the program for 2.5 years, and they stopped doing that. So currently, we have 3 certified or pre-qualified vendors in the district who are used in order to provide translation services. Interpretation is a little bit different, but for translation, I understand also that the Office of Asia Pacific Islander Constituency Services also provides a set of translators. Many times a language can be very nuanced, so one translation may not read as friendly or as coherent to the population that we want to reach. So translations often have to go through several layers of review to make sure that they're not only accurate but culturally competent and user-friendly.
Just one last question. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, some of you mentioned Greg Chen. I know him. Actually, I'm his friend. So he told me something about how you promote the Language Access Act in 2004. So I know it's a big struggle. But to me, the biggest struggle in this process is the budget. And Monica said it's an unfunded mandate. But I guess you have to have some budget to promote it. So what is the number of budget of last year? And do you have the data for the increasing budget in the last 10 years?
Well, you know, I think there's an important fact that maybe Aryan could explain in the beginning of the program, because let's say if you're an agency, you may translate, again, 30 to 50 documents, because none of them existed in a certain language. But then several years might go by, and you may not spend a lot of money translating. But why don't you say a little bit about the early history about how agencies approach that?
Sure. So in the beginning, the law passed with a $300,000 budget, and that was a $300,000 budget for the entire city. And that included staff and other personnel costs. So in the beginning, that budget, which was the Office of Human Rights budget for language access, was leveraged to assist, I think it was 6 agencies in the translation of their material. But we quickly understood that this was something that the Office of Human Rights couldn't take on as a regular practice. And as the phased implementation grew by 30+ agencies that needed to abide by this. So we did work with the budget office quite closely to try to create a line item for language access within agencies' budgets. I think that was successful for some agencies and not all. And it's taken time for agencies to realize that this is an actual expense because translations aren't cheap. Interpretation services aren't cheap. Acquiring training services and hiring bilingual staff all have their costs. But the benefits completely outweigh those costs, right? So it's just understanding what gaps they have to fill and what resources they need to fill them. So as Monica was talking about the exact number of translated documents, I can't really quantify an exact number of budget needs per agency because it's a very personal need depending on the agency. So the Metropolitan Police Department could have a budget necessity way higher than the Office of Human Rights, for example, which is only about 30 staff. So it's very agency dependent.
If I can just also say something about that. I know that there was an assessment done 5 years in after the law was passed, and at that point 1.26 million was spent on language access just in the first 5 years. But I think I would estimate that it's probably not just been double that, but much more than 1.2. You know, what's 1.6 times 2, whatever, 2.5 million. Let's say.
3.2.
I'm not going to make a joke about being Asian and not knowing math really well, but let's say it's 4 million, right? Dollars in the last 10 years. That's still not enough. That's because that's $4 million of doing. Not actually providing language access coordinators at all the agencies full-time, not translating all the documents, especially not into Asian languages, not having training. So the real cost would probably be much more of having everything done the way it's supposed to be done. But that was the last assessment that I remember seeing. And so one more quick thing, which is about pharmacies, and I know pharmacies are not named in the act explicitly, but pharmacies in DC receive money from DC government whenever a Medicaid or an Alliance patient comes to a pharmacy, they're going to get reimbursement. So one thing we've been working on is around pharmacies, which is so important to our senior communities, that we're able to get prescription information in our languages. So the estimate was done that it would cost a big pharmacy, and this was a study done in New York, but it would apply here too. The big chain pharmacies like CVS and Rite Aid and et cetera, it would cost them $2 a day. That's not a lot of money to be able to provide interpreting services in 6 different languages to the major immigrant communities. So that's because they would use a big contractor, and so they'd be able to get a much cheaper rate that way.
Neel, I just want to clarify something really quickly. So you can file a language access complaint with the Office of Human Rights. And if my staff could raise their hands, if anybody has a question about filing a complaint today, please come talk to us. Number 2, there are inexpensive ways to provide interpreters. Through telephonic interpretation, it costs like $2 or $3 a phone call. So I don't want to scare agencies or customers from asking for these services. Sure. Often, the costs of translation are also blown way out of proportion. You know, you can translate a document. It's a one-time cost of $300 or $400, and you can use it 1,000 times. So it's very cost-effective, and I don't want people to get the sense that this is too expensive, we can't do it. It's actually doable over time if it's done thoughtfully and if the agency has time to plan.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and thank you especially to our panelists. I hope this panel helped to start, for some of you, frame the conversation around language access. We are excited in the Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs to look at the next 10 years of programming and working with everyone in this room. So this concludes the first part of our event tonight. The next part will be taking place in the lower level atrium, which is just down the hall. And there we will be displaying our photo exhibit, and we'll be having some refreshments afterwards as well. So if you could all please join me in heading just down the hall to the atrium.
I'm so glad to be here with everyone tonight. And again, this is to celebrate Language Access Act 10th year anniversary. And we just had a panel discussion from 6 to 7, and it was a very lively discussion. And thank you so much again for all the panelists to be here today. So if all the panelists are here, could you please raise your hand? Francey, Aryan, Mónica, and Sapna. Okay, so let's give them a big round of applause for being on our panel, for the wonderful discussion earlier. And as many of you know, I am also first-generation immigrant to the United States. So I came to this country 1998, at the end of 1998. And I started working in DC government in 2001. So when I first started to work here, I was still a new immigrant. So a lot of things, actually, I had to learn as I go. So I definitely understand how it is to be an immigrant and people with language and cultural barriers to live in this country. So this is actually something that totally dear to my heart, and this is something I really care a lot about. And a lot of our services in our agency is really geared towards limited or non-English proficient population, which is the people who do not speak English very well and also have language barriers and cultural barriers. I want to quickly recognize a couple of people here, and we have a couple of people, actually several people who are featured in this photo project who are here today. But before I talk a little bit more about the photo project, which is called I Got a Story to Tell, I want to mention a couple of points from the report that we will be publishing next month. The one thing that I thought that it was really promising was that from FY 2011 to now, the district has seen the most steady increase in the percentage of Asian language translated documents. So this is a good segue to introduce our mayor, Mayor Gray. If you can actually pay attention a little bit, I know that food smells really good, and you guys are not really interested in hearing me right now, but I totally understand. But if you want to eat, you gotta hear first. This is like a timeshare deal, okay? You gotta hear, you gotta listen first. So as I mentioned, starting in 2011, we had seen a steady increase in Asian language document translation in DC government services and programs. So this is, again, good segue to introduce our mayor, Mayor Gray. As you know, 2011 was the year that mayor took the office. And many of you know that Mayor has been the really biggest supporter of our community and agency, and he really made my job easier because I really didn't have to try hard to let him know what it is about serving our community because he gets it. He really understands and he really supports. So I want to really thank Mr. Mayor, who I really admire and respect for all the services and all the support that you have provided to our community. So without further ado, I would like to recognize and welcome Mr. Mayor Vincent C. Gray, and he is the host of our reception tonight. Please welcome Mayor Gray.
Thank you very much, Julie. First of all, I want to say what a great job Julie has done. Going back to 2001, right? And really has done a fantastic job of leading the Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs. She is loved across this city, not only in the AAPIA community, but really people across the District of Columbia love Julie. I love her, and so many hundreds, if not thousands, of people do for the work that you do for so many people. How about a big hand for Julie Koo? You know, as yet another symbol of the respect for her and the work that's done, we have a number of cabinet members here. I saw Deputy Mayor Otero a couple of minutes ago. I see Lafayette Barnes, who is over to my left. We have Nick Majette, who is right in front of me. I saw Bill Howland, who is here, our DPW director. I saw Lionel. That's right. I saw Lionel Thomas, who heads our Commission on Arts and Humanities. And if I missed anybody, I really want to apologize. But yet another example of the respect for the work that is done in the Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs and respect for the leader of that office. I saw Mónica Palacio here, too. Where's Mónica? There she is, back in the back, way back there, head of our Office of Human Rights. This is the 10th anniversary of the Language Access Act in the District of Columbia, and we're very excited because there really are very few cities or states that have this kind of legislation in place that demonstrate respect for people and understand that given the increasing diversity, especially of this city, if we don't have the ability to communicate with people in the languages that they understand, we really are not a complete city. We had the 10th anniversary of the Language Access Act celebration over at the Carnegie Library just about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. And there were many, many people who came out then to recognize what has been done with the Act and also to acknowledge the continuing work that we have before us. There are people who are in this room who worked to be able to achieve passage of that Act 10 years ago, back in 2004. And I don't know who all they are in this room, but how about a big hand for them for doing something that was absolutely extraordinary. You know, and we worked hard also to be able to make sure that we continue to have a strong Asian and Pacific Islander community here in the District of Columbia. For those who don't know, it is the fastest growing population here in the District of Columbia. We have grown by 4.5%. I think we have 27,000. Is it 27,000? That's a lot of people, man. And it's a community that deserves to be paid attention to in the way that we've paid attention to. And again, to have somebody with Julie's talent to be able to do that, we really are blessed. One of the things that I did when I was the council chairman was to introduce the Chinatown Cultural Strategy, which was to try to make sure that we have a strong Chinatown in the future of the District of Columbia. You know, somebody said to me back then, it said, well, we don't have a Chinatown anymore. Now we're down to China Block. Well, we can see that coming back, don't we? We can see it happening. We can see what's happening on 7th Street. We can see what's happening on 8th Street. And it is going to continue to grow, ladies and gentlemen, because we're going to make sure that happens right here in the District of Columbia. We have put money into the budget for this year. We put money into the budget for next year, for fiscal year 15, that will ensure that we continue to have interpretation just as we have now. I can hear the voice off to my side here where the words are being translated for people who may have limited English proficiency, or in some cases, no English proficiency. And also being able to translate documents like this over here. And Julie, this is fantastic. This is actually our rankings card. These are rankings that have been accorded to the District of Columbia by like Forbes magazine and all these external entities that have looked at what's going on in the District of Columbia and said, we're going to make sure that you all are given the attention that you deserve. And so it's now been translated into, Mandarin? Into Korean, Vietnamese, and Mandarin. And that's the first time I have seen that. Once again, a great job by our Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs for having done that. We are not as far along as we want to be, but we are going to continue to make progress. There are things that we are doing. For example, we had 23 people who self-identified as Asian or Pacific Islander backgrounds as Asian or Pacific Islanders who are now members of our Metropolitan Police Department. And thanks again to the office for helping with that. We're now translating our emergency alerts into Chinese, to Mandarin, into Korean, and also into Vietnamese. And they're working with our Office of the Homeland Security and Emergency Management, the agency. Also, we are now able to we have more people who are psychologists or social workers who have these kind of professional skills that can help people who may have limited English proficiency or no English proficiency to be able to obtain those services. And how many of you all have seen the newsletter that's been put out by the Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs? I've seen it. Well, raise your hand if you haven't seen it. That makes us feel good, okay? You know, in all seriousness, we know that this is the fastest growing population in our city. I want you to walk around and look at the photo exhibit that Julie talked about. I got a story to tell. Walk around and look at that and see the photos. And also, since I'm coming to an end, you will have the food right before you very quickly. So I want to thank all you all for coming out. This is a great turnout for this event. And every event that I've ever been to that's put on by the Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs is always well done, is always well attended, and there's always a lot of enthusiasm and energy with everybody who comes out to these events. So thank you all very much. Let's continue to move forward with making sure that we are a place that not only is diverse, that has diverse communication also. Thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen, and enjoy the reception.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. He can really talk about any topic better than anybody else. So again, I will leave it at that. So before we move forward to our reception part, I mean, this is a reception, but before we move forward to move on to the food part, I would like to just talk about the photo project just a little bit, and also would like to thank a couple of people. As I mentioned, that this is something called I Got a Story to Tell. So as I mentioned earlier, that we are putting together a report, and also we have conducted a language access survey already. But this is something that we want to really put a human face beyond those numbers and reports and meetings and just discussion. So these are the people that the photos that we have featured 31 people in this project. So these are the people who are actually affected by the DC's Language Access Act. And we have Vietnamese parents to Chinese seniors to Korean business owners. You can actually see their faces and also their statement about how they think about Language Access Act or how Language Access Act actually affect their life. So you can please make sure to walk around and take a look at it. And what we're going to do is that we will actually have a touring exhibition throughout this year to go to different district buildings to showcase these pictures throughout this year. So hopefully you will get a chance to really take a look at those photos. I want to make sure to recognize a couple of staff members, actually all of the staff members, but also again, going back to Mayor Gray's support. This year, backing the Mayor Gray's support and also several agencies who helped us, like DCRA, DHCD, DHS, and also HBX. I'm sorry to using all those acronyms. So Regulatory Affairs, Human Services, Economic Development Agencies, and also I think, who am I missing? DHCD, Economic Development Agencies, and also HBX, the Healthcare Exchange Authority. They gave us the money to do the work on behalf of those agencies to reach out to the AAPI community. So we were able to actually hire 4 more outreach specialists to do the work. So right now, our agency is at 10-member staff structure, which is actually the biggest ever staff members that we ever had. So we were really able to expand our outreach this year. Neel Saxena, who is standing right here, he's our language access coordinator and my deputy director. And as I mentioned, he really cares so much. You should come out this way. He really cares so much about language access, of course. This is his area. And he single-handedly put together most of these projects, of course, with the help of outreach team. But I really want to recognize Neel Saxena for his wonderful work. And as many of you know Neel Saxena, and he was actually the one moderated the panel earlier, but he really knows about language access. I think I really can say that he is one of the most knowledgeable person who is in that language access field. Of course, in other area, of course, I know that you know a lot of different things, but so please give him another big round of applause. Thank you. And I want to also recognize Les Tosin, who is the photographer for this photo project. So thank you so much for providing this wonderful photography. Yeah. And also, if you are here in the room who are featured in this photo project, could you please raise your hand? I would like to recognize all those individuals who were featured in this photo project. And quickly, all of the OAPI staff members, all 10 of them, could you please raise your hand to be recognized? Thank you. And OAPI Commission, Commissioner OAPIA, if you are in the room, please raise your hand to be recognized. And last but not least, I would like to recognize, as you can see, actually, the noise in the room, the part of it is actually because of the live simultaneous interpretation. So I would like to also recognize AAPI ex-officials who are in the room. Ex-officials, I know Bill Holland and other ex-officials. Thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, I would like to really thank Korean Heritage Foundation and Honey Pig. So this is the restaurant who's going to be serving the food for tonight. How many of you guys know Honey Pig? Honey Pig, you know? This is actually most well-known Korean barbecue restaurant in this area. You heard about it. Yeah, Mr. Mayor heard about it, so you should know. So in this region, so Honey Peak has several locations, and they were graciously provided very generous amount of food for this event. And what I would like to do right now is that they would like to have the mayor to taste some of the food first. And yeah, I think mayor liked the idea. Mayor liked the idea instead of standing the line, right? So he's gonna actually go walk up to the food area to taste some of the food, and then we will open up the food area for reception. And I would also like to recognize Mr. Sam Yoon, who is the president of Korean Heritage Foundation. He's actually standing in the back, and also owner of Honey Peak, Mi-kyung Kim, who's also standing in the back with a really beautiful Korean costume. All right, so we're gonna move to the back right now, and we will resume our program. Please, sir.